Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Terry Martin and I am joined by Jeff Berkowitz from Chicago. We're going to be taking a look at a number of the major issues that are at play as we come out of the Thanksgiving Day weekend. And Jeff, thanks for joining us. The big story, I think, Jeff, why don't we start with Speaker Madigan, who has been the Speaker for something like 35 years, longest serving House Speaker in the history of the nation, and we may be seeing the end of that, perhaps. What do you think?
Well, if you about a week ago or so, we're taping this just prior to Thanksgiving, a little later after Thanksgiving. The feds came up with a major indictment. Been hearing about this. We've had a deferred prosecution agreement. The indictment itself is about 50 pages. And it is all about, without naming Mike Madigan as a defendant, in a sense, it is all about Mike Madigan because it is all about how people at ComEd conspired to get favorable legislation to their operations as a utility. And the way they conspired was to take actions that would benefit Mike Madigan with the expectation that Mike Madigan would benefit them in terms of making it feasible for ComEd to get the legislation they wanted to be a profitable utility. That is it in a nutshell. And
So let me say to the audience, Jeff is no longer a practicing attorney, but he is an attorney, or has been an attorney, so he knows the law. What is the prosecutorial agreement? What came down with ComEd? And then more recently, so the audience knows, we had indictments handed down that we'll get to. But on the first one, the prosecutorial agreement, what is that? And I believe that came out, if memory serves, in August.
well, basically, it's an agreement, excuse me, between ComEd and the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Department of Justice, the United States government, in which the agreement is ComEd will pay $200 million, I think it is, fine, and they plead guilty. They did it, okay, and they will cooperate with the U.S. Attorney's Office in the prosecution of this case. And they outlined basically what I've just said. There is an agreement here. There was a conspiracy. There was an effort by Commonwealth Edison, ComEd, to take actions which would benefit the speaker, and the speaker in turn would did things that benefited ComEd. And what does the speaker want? He wants to maintain his political power. He needs people who work for him. He needs to pay them. He used to do it through patronage. That got harder to do. So he looked at ComEd as kind of a piggy bank. He could go to them and they could have money and there'd be an intermediary and the money would go to the intermediary and then it would go to the people who would help Speaker Madigan execute his political duties. And in return, Mike Madigan, everybody knows if you want legislation, it doesn't go anywhere unless Mike Madigan says so. Those are the rules of the Illinois State House. And so people talk about getting rid of Mike Madigan. Well, if they want to change the way Illinois operates, they're going to have to dramatically reduce the power of the speaker, whoever that is, change the rules so it's more of a majority decides whether legislation will come forward as opposed to, or maybe even not even a majority,
So let
but
me
as
let me
opposed to
just
one
sum
man.
this up. The thing is, Speaker Madigan is very powerful. He controls all the legislation going through the House, and if you're on his wrong side, your bill ain't going to go anywhere. Whether you're a lawmaker or whether you're a business interest, ComEd knows that. People who have used to be in the House of Representatives, some of them are now working as lobbyists for ComEd. And so the allegation is that there was a quid pro quo between ComEd and Speaker Madigan, that ComEd would get legislation passed that was favorable to ComEd, and in addition, Speaker Madigan could get some goodies from some things he wanted from ComEd, like having people hired. The allegation is these people that the Speaker wanted hired, in certain circumstances, would never have to report to work, and they were ghost
Right.
payroll people. So it was a way for Madigan to allegedly take care of some of his people that he wanted to take care of without it having to come out of his bankroll, because the monies for their salary would be paid by ComEd. Is that more or less the short, long and short of it?
It is, and the indictment, which is a document, 50 pages, that is filed with the court by the U.S. Attorney's Office. That's now public. That 50-page document. It tells you that the defendants in this case are Anne Pramaggiore, the CEO of Commonwealth Edison from
Former,
2012.
I mean,
Former, yes, she's resigned in 2019, but as an aside, I actually recruited Anne Pramaggiore in 1998 to come to Commonwealth Edison. We can come back to that later as to who Anne Pramaggiore was and what she was like in 1998 when she came to Commonwealth Edison, and the Anne Pramaggiore that is painted by the indictment. And are those two the same people? And so we have Anne Pramaggiore as a major player here and directing these activities is the allegation, and working with her on these activities that we've been talking about, this conspiracy, is John Hooker, who's the executive vice president, a very senior, that title means you're very senior, very powerful at Commonwealth Edison, dealing with government relations.
well, let's give the names. We don't have to give their all biographies, but we got John Hooker, we
Well,
got
right.
Anne Pramaggiore, we got Jay.
Before you get to Jay, you've got Fidel Marquez, who's not named in this indictment because he was named in a criminal information filed maybe a month ago. He's apparently pled guilty and is cooperating with the government. But he's mentioned in this document in the indictment because he's a part of this conspiracy. You've got Pramaggiore, you've got Hooker, you've got Fidel Marquez working. And of course,
Now,
you've
Marquez is not a name, as you say, that most people would recognize. So do tell us who that is.
he is a senior vice president working in the regulatory area and the government relations area, underneath or just below in the hierarchy John Hooker. So you get Pramaggiore, and her report, direct report would be Hooker reporting to Pramaggiore, and then Marquez apparently reporting to Hooker. And of course
And the
we
fourth
have
person was,
well, we have those three individuals. One, of
oh,
course,
well, you
as I
added,
said,
yeah,
only
you
two.
added the one. So actually, we're talking about five people.
So we've
Anyway,
got
let's
two, and
quickly just go
so
through
the
the names so
so
people
yeah,
have
the
an idea.
third individual. Yes. So the quick person to have in mind is you need somebody in between those folks and Mike Madigan, who's not named as a defendant. And who do you have as an in between? Well, you've got Mike McLean, 73 now, who knew Mike Madigan starting out when they were young guys coming to the state house. I guess that would be in the 70s,
Mike
and
McLean
knew
was a
him all
former
along.
state rep from the late 70s and early 80s, and one of the close friends of Mike Madigan, I think that's fair to say, for a number of years. So someone that Mike
Extremely
Madigan
close.
trusted
Extremely close.
McLean.
Yes, a confidant, as they say.
Right.
And McLean was a lobbyist being paid by Commonwealth Edison, being paid, uh,
And he had
well,
he had retired a
by
couple
being,
years
excuse me,
ago.
being paid as a lobbyist. You're paid by your clients who you lobby for Commonwealth Edison, yeah, and you're a
Right.
consultant. Okay.
I want to advance this just a bit. So what happened is we had the
Can I say one thing,
prosecutorial
Terry?
agreement with
Yeah,
ComEd back in about August, right?
yeah, but before you get back to the prosecutorial agreement, the other person mentioned prominently in the indictment is Jay Doherty, former president of the City Club of Chicago, former Democratic Party consultant. When I talked with Jay, and many people would talk with Jay if you go to City Club events as media members, I would say, well, what do you do now? This is 2011 to 2019. He said, hey, Jeff, I do the City Club. That's it. Okay. Turns out for those 8 years, he was pulling down something like $3 million being funneled to him, much of that, but not all
Over
of
the
that, being
course of
funneled
those
to other
years,
people.
not per year, right?
Yes. Right, more like something like $300,000 or $400,000 a year, and much of this, but not all of it, is outlined in the indictment. The money that is coming
And
to
and so
in
let me
payments to
just
Jay
advance
Doherty.
this so that you who have often gone to the City Club were unaware, and you're a fairly aware person in Chicago. So people didn't know that Jay Doherty, you're saying, was working with ComEd. Is that what you're saying?
Right, he certainly wasn't telling me, and I don't think he was telling anybody else. He probably didn't want to be asked about that
All right, so
because it was a
those are the people
conspiracy.
that were recently named in the indictment that we just went over. And that indictment came
Right.
down, as we taped this, roughly a week ago or so. Since that time, or preceding that, and I believe it was in August off the top of my head, was a prosecutorial agreement in which ComEd pled guilty that you referred to. After that came down, the House Republicans demanded an investigative committee in the Illinois House of Representatives, which was formed. There were 3 Democrats on that committee and 3 Republicans. The Republicans are Grant Worley, Tom Demmer, who's Assistant Majority or Minority Leader, and Deanne Mazzocchi. I had an opportunity to speak to Representative Mazzocchi the day after these indictments came down, and she said a number of things that we'll hear as far as what the Republicans want and why they're frustrated by this committee that's being controlled by the Democratic chairman, Chris Welch, that they're not holding enough meetings. They've only had 2 in something like 82 days since it was formed. Let's listen to what Representative Mazzocchi had to say, and we'll come back.
ComEd gave testimony that was absolutely devastating to the speaker, confirmed that there was an email where, again, the speaker has been professing he lacked knowledge on all of these issues, confirmed that, in fact, there was an email that was sent from the speaker's office manager to ComEd CEO Ann Pramaggiore, in connection with the trying to get this Madigan political ally onto a ComEd board seat. So we know that there is information out there. And because we are an investigating committee, it's been astounding to me that the Democrats have been so utterly uninterested in actually investigating. And Chris Welch keeps coming up with every excuse under the sun as to why he can't actually show up and do the committee's work. One of the things that I think the committee absolutely needs to do is we need to vote to issue a subpoena for Mike Madigan to come testify before the committee under oath.
Under oath is what the Republicans want. They want Speaker Madigan, and they don't want to have just a committee in name only, Jeff.
Well, as Chris Welch is on the hot seat now because he certainly doesn't want to issue a subpoena, and yet it seems like the obvious thing to do. It also seems obvious that Mike Madigan's not going to come testify under oath, not while he's possibly has an indictment hanging over his head. But give people some meat here. Let people know a little bit about what was Commonwealth Edison actually. What was it that Commonwealth Edison and allegedly, and excuse me, what was Mike Madigan getting out of this? Well, one thing allegedly that's outlined in the indictment is that a law firm that he likes was retained by Commonwealth Edison and virtually guaranteed 850 hours of billable work, which we're talking into the millions as to what that's worth. Okay, it's alleged that this is the Victor Reyes law firm. I shouldn't say it's alleged. It's rumor and innuendo. It is not stated in. They refer to this, of course, as law firm A and lawyer A without giving the names of these people. But so that's one thing that the allegation is that Madigan wanted that, even though he's not named here. He's a beneficiary of this agreement, according to this document. And these were all done as the conspirators referred to Mike Madigan as our friend. Mike McLean would say to Commonwealth Edison, our friend wants this law firm. And this law firm, he's going to want it retained. If you don't do what you're supposed to do here, he'll call me, I'll come back to you. It'll all end up that way. Okay. Our friend. He was careful not to say Mike Madigan. He would say our friend. What else did McLean say that our friend wanted? Well, for a long time, he says, we've had this agreement where interns from the ward, 13th ward, that is Mike Madigan's ward, Mike Madigan's wards and his state house seat are the 13th ward.
And he got them hired at ComEd, or they did summer internship work. So it was one that we don't spend too much time on that. But there were a handful of wants from the Madigan camp to ComEd, it is alleged, and that's what they got out of it, along with some people being hired, as we said before, to work in what I think prosecutors would call ghost payroll, where people are paid on the ComEd payroll. But
when you get to that,
well,
instrumental,
go ahead.
Instrumental, Terry, in that is Jay Doherty. because he's then the intermediary where ComEd is paying him, and he in turn is the allegation is paying people who weren't doing work for Commonwealth Edison, but invoices and things were set up so the internal controls would look like this money that was going to Jay Doherty was for consulting service he was provided. And it had to be Jay Doherty. So there was single source. There were rules why we weren't getting open bidding for this service that was being performed by Jay Doherty, but it was presented that this was a single source because he had such great insight, such great knowledge to perform these services when he, in fact, was not apparently performing the services. Instead, that money, in large part, was getting funneled to people to do political work at the direction of others, for presumably Mike Madigan. So Doherty is instrumental. Remember, we said there were intermediaries here. We have the people at Commonwealth Edison. We got McLean, who's an intermediary dealing with the allegation with Mike Madigan. And then we got Jay Doherty, who's getting this money and is being the person who's dealing with the people who are providing political work to Mike Madigan in the 13th ward and the 23rd ward, and the aldermen are involved
We're
is
getting
the
too much
allegation.
detail here.
No, but it's
we're missing
important,
some.
Terry. Excuse me, Terry. It is important. It is important because
We need
everybody
to
wants to
connect the
do.
dots first.
Everybody
Let's
wants to
go.
do what you're trying to do. You want to make it about the horse race. It's not the horse
No,
race.
I don't want to make about the
Okay.
horse race, but I think we're confusing people by getting too much in the weeds here, and they don't care.
It's
And I
not
want
in the
them to
weeds,
understand.
Terry. Jay Doherty is a named
Let me talk and
no.
have a word in here. You talk for
Yeah,
5 minutes.
yeah.
The fact of the matter is, we need to advance the story here. And the question is, was Speaker Madigan going to be able to survive? We have a number of House Democrats who are saying they're not going to support him come January. The new legislature is going to be formed in January. And we also need to include at this point that Speaker Madigan put out a statement denying that he had any involvement, saying, as you know, I was not named in the indictment, and I have always worked in the best interest of the people of Illinois. So it's important that we get Speaker Madigan mention that he is claiming he has done nothing wrong. So now,
Right, but you're missing the food. You're missing the meat of the indictment because
all right,
Jay
now
Doherty
give us
is
the meat of the
prominently
indictment,
there.
because
Yeah, the meat
otherwise we
of the
didn't have the
indictment.
context for what you were saying.
Okay, the meat of the indictment is that Madigan is up to this in his eyeballs. He's not named there, and but in terms, you shouldn't say Madigan is up to this. The allegation is he's excessively involved. That's what Deanna Mazzacci was saying, is that there are emails that connect that she's seen that I haven't seen. And they're doing this as a part of the special investigation. And you said, oh, everybody wants to know, will Speaker Madigan still be Speaker at the end of this year? But first, they have to know, what is this indictment about? What are the allegations? Forget Speaker Madigan for a second, because the problem here is we have alleged corruption going on at very high levels, and we have alleged corruption involving the speaker. And if the speaker is gone, that is still a major issue. And we need to know who is running the state, and we need to know what the laws are that are running the state house and running the state. And that's not being talked about. What's being talked about by the mainstream media as we tape this are, well, are there 14 people who are against Madigan or 15? Well, if there are 15, he can't be the speaker. Well, maybe he can cut a deal
Well,
and he
that
could be
matters
there
if
for
he's
two
not going to
years.
be the speaker anymore, right? I mean,
Well,
if
it matters that they
if
know.
Madigan matters, it matters if he's going to be gone. And as far as
Do
who's
they,
going to run the state, then obviously we have a governor. And the governor wouldn't say this, but I suspect that the governor would maybe not cry too many tears if Speaker Madigan was replaced, because every governor who has been the governor in the course of, since going back to probably Jim Edgar's time, has had trouble trying to be a governor because Madigan has so much control as the House Speaker. So it matters, and that's where it matters to people.
but even if Speaker Madigan is gone, even if he doesn't have the votes, even if Greg Harris or somebody else replaces him, if you don't change the power, if you don't change the law that gives the speaker the power, then Greg Harris will have too much power.
No,
So people,
no, I think this is yes and no. Yes and no. What I would say is yes, the other big issue here, which you were bringing up, and I want the people to understand, is we need to have reforms in the powers of the Speaker in the way legislation is moved through the Illinois House of Representatives. And so, yes, we need to have that. But also, Mike Madigan had his own web of relationships, and that's really how he can also control power. It wasn't merely just the House rules. But, you know, if Madigan, if there's a committee hearing and the Speaker wants to move legislation through a committee, and there are people on that committee who may not be favorable to the bill he wants to move, who are, you know, Democratic members of that committee, he can replace them for a day and make, you know, Jeff Berkowitz, who may not be on the Judiciary Committee or the Commerce Committee, and he can replace Jeff Berkowitz and put Terry Martin in there for a day so that he gets the votes that he needs to move a bill out of committee or to block a bill. And so that's one of the things that you know, people might want to look at as far as reforms. I'm sure there's a long list.
But the other main point here, the other main point is this started a long time ago, maybe even prior to 2011, with having interns being specified by Mike Madigan. His quoted 10 interns. I want these folks. You're not going to look at the resume. You're not going to do an interview implicitly. This is what's set out. I'm saying they should be there and they will. And see, people may say, well, that's a minor thing, Jeff. Don't worry about that. That's quasi small patronage. Right, and that's outlined in the indictment, but also outlined in the indictment is Mike Madigan. The allegation is that Mike Madigan wanted somebody, a specific person, to be placed on the board of Commonwealth Edison. And the allegation is he tried. And the rumor is that's Juan Ochoa, and he was placed on the board, and I think now may be gone. But the point is, when you start small with things like interns, and then you get a law firm that you're specifying the Commonwealth hire, and then you get this vast apparatus of political operatives working under Mike Madigan's direction, but being paid for essentially with money being funneled to Jay Doherty and then going to the actual people doing the political work. You can see how what's smarted as perhaps as a small thing like patronage for interns into, do you really want to have the Speaker of the House controlling who sits on the board of Commonwealth Edison? One person, two, 10. Well, then you don't even need Anna Pramaggiore. Well, then Mike Madigan, or whoever's Speaker and has that power, they can run Commonwealth Edison. Nobody's talking about this, Terry. This is the point. It is not about whether Greg Harris is going to be the Speaker in June. Because as you pointed out, if you don't change the law and you don't change the way in which the House operates, you're going to have the same kind of problems. Look, the state is in terrible trouble. We can shift gears a little bit here. We have a $400 billion pension hole. Do you think that's unrelated to the power of the Speaker? Not when you have $13 million coming to you from unions, and those are the very unions that are related to this pension hole. And when you have junk bond status, when you have schools who are in major problems financially, when you have all of these things that happen, they are related to the. So bring it home to the people watching this, Terry. Bring it home to them. They're concerned about property taxes. That's part of the discussion we're having here. And you're not going to fix their property taxes. You're not going to lower their property taxes until you change the system, until you change in which the kind of pensions we have, until you change the Constitution and amend the Constitution so you can decrease the pension benefits. You have to have major reforms to the state of Illinois or the
For
people
those
who
who
we're
don't,
talking
you
to.
love to roll around in the weeds of this stuff and savor every little fragment of information. I'm trying to get it to information for the people that don't do that and just say, what do we need to know? Just tell us what we need to know. And I would say it simply this
Yes.
way. Mike Madigan was one of the people that put together the Illinois Constitution in 1970. For 50 years, he has been a key player. For about the last 35 years, he has been the Speaker, except for a 2-year period. And when we look at Illinois and the problems that beset Illinois that Jeff was just referring to, property taxes, pension reform, Many would argue, many behind the scene, many frustrated Democratic House members, that Mike Madigan has been the cork in the bottle that nothing can move because we don't have a change in the power at the top. When people argue about term limits, the Republicans, when I was covering Congress, did not pass term limits in the Contract with America back in 1995. It was the only thing in the Contract with America they didn't pass, but they did add term limits at that time to chairmen of committees. And there's going to be a very good argument that we ought to have term limits, if for no one else, for whoever serves as House Speaker. Because I have seen people come into the body who have served for years, people like Lou Lang and Joe Lyons, long-term House members who would have liked to have been Speaker in their own right, and their entire career was spent in the shadow of Mike Madigan. So what people ought to understand is this is a political earthquake for the state of Illinois if Mike Madigan were replaced. Where it goes from here, we'll have to see. The other thing, going back to very quickly to Representative Maki and talking about this special investigative committee, there's also pressure on Representative Chris Welch, who the Republicans would say is doing the bidding
Terry,
of Mike Madigan.
can we stop and get away from the weeds and Chris Welch and all of this?
I wanted to finish the point. The point
yes,
is
it's
that
been a month
we've
of Sundays,
got to have
Terry.
the investigative committee do their work, and it puts pressure on Chris Welch to have some meetings and then answer: Are you the Democrats in the House going to be protecting Mike Madigan, or are you going to come out and stand up for good government?
Okay, but if they obsess on Mike Madigan, they're missing the point. The people watching this, Terry, all throughout the state of Illinois, they've seen their home values decline over years now, 6 or 7. They've seen population leave Illinois. This is all related to this, Terry. You cannot have a single party. You cannot keep raising taxes. You cannot have a pension problem. That means that somebody can see you don't have the wherewithal to run this government properly unless you address those fundamental financial issues, unless you have fundamental reform that extends way beyond Mike Madigan. That's the point. If you want to get to the weeds, people can look outside and see their front lawn is growing weeds. Those are real weeds, Terry, not the kind of weeds we're talking about. And they're growing because there's an out-migration. Why is there an out-migration? Because people's home values are declining. Why are the home values declining? Because property taxes are way too high. Why are property taxes way too high? Because we have, in part, a system of pensions that is completely unsustainable. Something our Green New Deal friends will understand. Unsustainable. Now, those are real weeds, Terry, the weeds that are growing in their front lawn.
The thing that people are moving out for, and it goes to Mike Madigan, and it goes to Illinois government, and it goes to, frankly, the corruption, the culture of corruption that is well known in Illinois, and it emanates primarily from Chicago, where Chicago and the politicians of Chicago control all of state government, virtually all of state government. And people are tired of waiting for good government. They've waited for 40 years. They've waited for change. We've seen efforts to lower property taxes, and the Supreme Court throws it out. And people are like, I'm done. I'm done here. We're moving on.
Okay.
We're going on with our lives.
So we're
Illinois,
done too,
Tim. You
Tim.
can do what you want.
Okay.
We have about
We're
1 minute
done.
left here, Jeff,
Yeah,
before we
okay.
close up. So I'll let you.
Well, okay, so a good way to close it out now is this indictment is a dagger. Indictment is a dagger, not just at Speaker Mike Madigan, but at the Illinois Democratic Party. I mean, Madigan can say, oh, well, Durkin's involved in this too because we passed this legislation in 2016 and that was supported by the governor, Governor Rauner. And so, no. This is aimed at the Democratic Party, which enables Mike Madigan to persist in this malfunctioning of government. And we'll see what happens with the indictment.
Jeff, thanks. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll see you next time.